Hi, I'm Philip Carr-Gomm, and this is This Magical Life, your guide to the intersection of psychology, spirituality, and wisdom. Welcome, everybody, to This Magical Life. This is a podcast where we explore interesting topics: consciousness, spirituality, druidry, meditation, all those kind of things. Today, I'm interviewing someone who I haven't met. The last time we met, we just discovered, was 28 years ago. And so a lot of water has flowed under the bridge. A lot of things have changed within our lives and within the world, of course. I'm with Frank Owen. Frank, welcome to This Magical Life. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Phil.
Yeah, fantastic. Now, 28 years ago, I remember I have this abiding memory of you sitting in our kitchen,
Yep.
having a meal together, and you had just published, I think, you can correct me here, but your first book. Is that right? Had you just
That's
published it?
correct.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
the
Which
misbuilt path. Yep.
The Mist-Filled Path. And now, which name did you publish that under? What were
So that
you?
was published under Frank McEowen.
Frank McEowen.
Yeah.
That's right. And I remembered you had been in Ireland, and you're from the States,
Yes.
and you were really trying to kind of track your ancestral line, as far as I know.
Mm,
Tell
that's
us a bit about. I mean, a number of people watching this may well have read the Mist-Filled Path,
mm, mm.
but tell us about the book and about why you wrote it.
Sure. It really, when I think back on that book and that time in my life, I kind of categorize or classify that book as an expression of cultural soul retrieval. Grew up in the States in a family in the Deep South, and had heard some stories about our ancestors in Scotland and England and Ireland and also Wales, but that was about the extent of it. A few anecdotes here and there, but not a lot of detail. And really, from a very early age, I would say around 12, I began to feel this compelling drive to reconnect with some form of nature-based spirituality, but I didn't know where to turn.
Hmm.
And so, probably the first place that I went to really look into this was the Taoist tradition.
Hmm.
And then I won't go into all the background story, but one thing led to another. And I ended up crossing paths with some indigenous people here in North America. And so that led to me being in ceremonies, sweat lodges, and so forth, and even going through what is called the sun dance among the Lakota people.
And this would have been what age? Old were you when you were doing that?
I was in my early 20s.
Early 20s. In which part of the States?
Well, it started out in the southern part of the states, like North Carolina.
Hmm.
And then I moved up to northern Wisconsin and spent some time with the Anishinaabe people, also known as the Ojibwe.
Yeah.
And then I went out to Colorado for grad school
Hmm.
and began spending time with the Lakota people up in South Dakota.
That's great. And grad school was the Naropa Institute, wasn't it?
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So were you immersing yourself in Buddhism as well at that time?
I was studying Buddhism a good bit. Although that is a Tibetan-inspired institution, I was spending most of my time with Japanese Zen teachers and really working with that sense of heart, mind, and cultivation through meditation practice.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So you're still in your kind of mid-20s by now, something like
Mm.
this.
hmm
Yeah. And then, okay, so then what happened?
Well, then I went up to South Dakota for this ceremony, and it's a very closed thing now, but at the time there was some openness to non-native people being in the ceremonies.
Hmm.
And you have to be sponsored to be involved. It's not something you just walk up into. So I had, quote unquote, paid my dues, as they say, spent a lot of time up there with the people, bringing clothes, bringing food, helping out around the fire, and so forth. But in the midst of that ceremony, I began to have experiences. Some imagery began to come to me that I didn't quite know what it meant. Um, and now I know, in hindsight, it was every bit the pocket of ancestral memory was opening up for me.
Hmm.
And I remember an old man came up to me after the ceremony and said, you're always welcome here, but you really need to go look into your own background and find the same thing that you're attracted to among us. You have it in your background and you need to go find out what that is.
Yeah.
And so that began the journey of me exploring Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, and not only academically and reading and studying, but also going and spending a lot of time on the land.
Right, that's great. And so, you after you traveled around Ireland, and you wrote The Mist-Filled Path, and then The Spiral of Memory and Belonging. How long did what was the gap between those two books?
That would have been Misfell Path came toward the end of the 90s, and then Spiral of Memory and Belonging was around 2002,
Right.
2003, somewhere in there.
Okay, so we were in the new millennium then. And what's the difference between the two books, would you say?
The first one is more personal. It's
Yeah.
about that sense of profound disconnection
Hmm.
from ancestral knowledge, wisdom. And of course, all of your writings were instrumental in my rediscovering the Druidic principle, which of
Hmm.
course I didn't, was not raised with that in my active awareness.
Hmm.
So that really, once that dropped into place and I had a kind of framework for understanding, okay, this is our tradition. And yes, it was suppressed by the Romans and then by the church. And but it's this it's like the Tao. You don't get rid of the Tao. It's a
Yeah.
river that flows under everything.
Yeah.
Spiral of Memory and Belonging, in contrast, was less about me and my exploration and more about Ireland and the primal energies of Ireland. And granted, what I write about in that book is my perception through my own filters
Hmm.
of what I was experiencing in terms of the land, in terms of the people. And I connected with a man named Martin Duffy, who is the
Hey.
spiritual director of the Irish Center for Shamanic Studies.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we went around to some places, and yeah, so things were activated in that process.
In that process. Great. And when did you join the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids? Was it around that time or?
No, it was earlier. It was
Uh-huh.
around, I guess, 1995 is
Oh,
when,
wow. Oh, wow.
yes, I
Okay.
began working with the course, the Bardic grade back in 95, 96.
Great. Yes, and of course, I guess that the Irish Centre of Shamanic Studies, they've got a beautiful place, haven't they? I know Duffy.
Yes, it
Yeah,
is.
yeah,
Amazing.
yeah, fantastic. And then your books, I know, got a lot of interest. A lot of people were really interested. You've got a beautiful way of writing and very evocative and all the rest of it. And then at some point you disappeared.
I
Yeah,
did. I
tell
went
us about that.
I went inward. It was a combination of things. On the one hand, I had connected with a dear teacher, and um, she was, there's no way to sort of put her in a bucket. It's
Yeah.
like she had lots of influences, and she passed away. Very
Hmm.
dear person in my life. And I think that grief process around that is probably the first thing that took me inward and off the map, so to speak. The other was I was getting some blowback from certain sectors of the readership around writing about my experiences and feeling like I should not have.
I
Like,
remember that. I remember there was some kind of difficult stuff going around, but I can't
yeah,
honestly remember what it was about.
yeah,
Um,
yeah. And so I think part of that contributed to my like, okay, I want to take some time, go inward, go hermit, as I called it,
mm,
and really take stock of, okay, what, in addition to my grieving process around my late teacher,
yeah.
um, really reassess what's the path and what's the future for me. And that ultimately led me to, along with the invitation of the Bardic grade, of course,
Hmm.
was this deep dive into poetry.
Some of the blowback was around all this issue of sort of, what do we mean by authentic? What is
Right,
indigenous?
right.
What is cultural appropriation? Who has the,
Exactly,
you know,
exactly. Yeah,
I think the discourse has moved on somewhat now.
I agree.
and the sort of nuancing of all these, we don't need to go into that because it'll take us in it's a big thing, but
Yes.
it's an interesting one to engage with. But at the time, there was that it was around that, I think. And so how long did you go? How long did you get out of the public limelight and kind of disappear in that way or go
Yeah.
home?
Well, and yeah, to your point, a lot of, I think back on it and I was having experiences. I was trying to navigate that process of cultural soul retrieval and
Yeah,
ancestral awareness and connection with nature. And I was trying to find a nomenclature that would express that and work with that. And, encountering the writings of Mircea Eliade and the term shamanism, for
mm,
instance, which, as you know, has become like some people like that word because it speaks of a cross cultural phenomenon. Other people do not like the word because it lifts that out of the Siberian
exactly.
context.
Yeah,
And we have our own terms.
yeah,
And then the other one is Celtic. What's meant by Celtic? Some people, it's a focus on linguistics, and some it's more a reference to cultures in Central Europe. And what is Celtic? What isn't Celtic? All of that became kind of a hornet's nest.
yeah,
And then I realized, this is not my fight. I'm not interested in debating that. I'm just going to
yeah,
go off over here. So
yeah.
that was probably 2005 when
Okay.
I made a conscious decision to, yeah, go hermit, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. And so what did you do from 2005? What direction did your life take? And
So I really, from a spiritual point of view, gravitated toward anything that fit that bill of hermit. So I began studying the old wayfaring poets of China and Japan,
Hmm.
emulating that kind of lifestyle, which was
Mm.
very deeply connected to nature, meditation practice, but also poetry. And that just felt like a natural fit. And it's a natural fit with the Druidic framework, also, of course.
Yeah, of course,
Uh,
yeah.
and so, yeah, that really became my focus. And then I had a day job. I worked in museum development and copywriting. And so I did that about 13 years.
In which part of the world?
I was living in Mississippi, and then I was living in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay. And, because I know it was you who kind of turned me on to the hermit poets, and I have these books on your recommendation. I
Oh,
got
yeah,
classical
yeah,
Chinese
really.
poetry and The Sky Above and The Great Wind. Yeah, wonderful stuff.
Ryokan.
Um,
Yeah.
and of course, your poetry. I was scrabbling around before we met this evening, trying to find your poetry books because I just love your recent books.
Mm.
And as I've read out some of your poems on She Was
Yes.
Druid, and they're just fantastic. How did how did the kind of experience of finding your Irish roots and your, I mean, let's use the word Celtic roots. How did you did how did it to get interested in China? Was it did you have to kind of switch off and switch focus, or was it just a natural flow to be focusing on Chinese culture and
Right.
poetry?
It felt like, initially, it felt like the attraction was more to the poetry,
Hmm,
the simplicity of it, the brevity of it. I have some long poems that go on and on and on, but they are masters of consolidating a moment in just a few lines.
yeah,
So I was attracted to that. I was attracted to the nature piece. Um, and all of them are embedded in their culture, but are somewhat fringe dwellers, even within their particular cultural context.
yeah,
So there was something about that was attractive. So I kind of think of it now as it's that cultural soul retrieval piece was when I was looking at Celtic ancestry and putting that kind of on the back burner, continuing to let it simmer. But yeah, as you say, changing focus.
yeah. Just and then when did you were you writing poetry all through this time, or did you have a period where you weren't writing poetry and then it kind of started to flow?
Yeah. I think the poetry that really began more in, yeah, 2004, 2005,
Yeah.
experimenting. I've been experimenting with poetry for much longer than that, but it wasn't until then that I began to get serious about publishing.
And then since then, in sort of recent years, you've had a number of anthologies, collections published, haven't you? Give us the names of those.
Yeah, so those three books, one is called The School of Soft Attention.
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, and one is, in fact, I have them right here. I'll show you. So that's The School of Soft Attention.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then there is the second one was The Temple of Warm Harmony,
Yeah.
and
Wonderful
the third
titles.
one was Stir Up of the Sun and Moon.
Ah, that's one I haven't got. I'll have to get that. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Uh,
so I'm currently in a process of putting a new one together. Some of these are rolling off the press, and
mm,
I'm kind of going in a different direction now. But there will be some poems of those three that make their way into this fourth collection.
Great, great. So we'll do keep us updated about that. And what I'll do is, I don't know if you have one to hand right away. If not, what I can do is I will find my copies and read a poem to listeners so they can get a feel for it. Shall I do that, or do you have one that you would love to read right
Sure,
now?
let me grab one that this is from the first collection,
Hmm,
and it actually received what's called a push cart prize nomination.
great.
So this is entitled The Bouquet of the Last Direction.
Hmm,
When the soul becomes unburdened, it's like a new saddle on a fresh horse. Suddenly the trail feels right again, and the strong horizon line in front of you as you turn becomes its own form of soothing medicine. Something of the sting and burn of the old poison may linger, but having crossed over the shadowlands into new open territory, one can almost pick up the scent of blooming flowers within. You start to notice all the things you hadn't been, all because you'd been bound up with the echoes of losses and hauntings. You know you're ready when ghosts start chanting from the edge of your life, traveler, good traveler, your crying for vision time is over. Time to re inhabit the human world. Then the simplest of the 10,000 things start to reach out to you to welcome you home again. The morning star, the blue sky with its utter completeness, the serrated clouds coming over the rising pine covered hills. Even the food tastes better in the land of the great eastern sun. You may find the wandering wild animal of your heart is somehow more free to travel back through time, to pick back up with sources of beauty and power you had put down. And maybe, just maybe, you'll see yourself now through your childhood eyes, and you'll stand forgiven and realize the magic you had then never left you. You just forgot how to listen.
fabulous. Thank you so much. I'm so
Mm.
glad you read that. And yeah, because of course there's another strand that you haven't talked about in your journey, which is your explorations of psychology and
Mm.
personal psychology, Jungian psychology. I think did you start studying psychology at Naropa, or was it something that came later?
I took some psychology in my undergrad earlier on and did not, I gravitated toward that, but I had not yet really gotten serious about it until grad school. And my focus became Jungian psychology, dream work, the inner myth. And then there is another individual, the late Arnold Mandel, who was also a Jungian, but began to explore the Jungian approach as it applies to the body and to
Yeah,
stay
his
on.
work, his process-oriented psychology is wonderful, isn't it?
Yeah, it
Yeah.
really is. It really is. So I did some trainings with Arnold and
Oh, great.
Arnie, as we called him, and
Yeah,
some of his proteges. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Fantastic. And do you do any kind of one-to-one work with people? Do you
I do. That's primarily what I do these days. I call it soul faring,
Yeah,
and it's kind of all over the map because I find that different people gravitate toward it. Some people are doing that inner archetypal depth psychology type work.
mm,
It's not reparative psychotherapy per se. And then I have folks who are undergoing different trainings like chaplains in training, some psychotherapists.
yeah,
And then the other group is really creatives, people, would be writers, would be poets, some people who have kind of hit a block
yep.
in terms of wanting to move forward. And so, yeah, that work is primarily what I'm doing now.
That's fantastic, and we'll give a link in the
Mhm.
notes of this program for that, so people, if people are interested, they can contact you. And also for the book from which that
Mhm.
fantastic poem came from as well. Um, and I mean, one of the interesting things is a real interest to me now is the way, with this bardic training, we're talking about poetry, and you read out a poem like that, and it's so, it touches so deeply, and it's working at a, for me, at a kind of psychological level, at a spiritual level, at a kind of linguistic level, cultural level, so on. And so this the work of the bard, the more I think about it, and I think about the bard, the ovate, and the druid,
Mhm.
the more I think about that it's representing these kind of three archetypal service goal,
Mhm.
soul orientations, if you like. That, of course, there are many archetypes and there are many kind of aspects of ourselves that we can develop and that can be fascinating to explore. But in terms of service goals, if you like, one of the strongest ones is this goal to create in the world, to give to the world through one's
Mhm.
art,
Mhm.
creativity. Yeah, and that's that whole bardic stream.
Yeah.
And then the other great kind of archetype that works through us is the healer, if you like.
Mhm.
That we, and they're all manifestations of love. I mean, it's essentially love.
Mhm.
Love through creativity, love through wanting to help and heal people, which is, if you like, the shamanic path, which is the ovate way. And then finally, the druid, the sort of the sage currently, the desire for wisdom, the wisdom not just for ourselves, but to be of help to other people and to
Mhm.
give of one's love to others through, it's like, in a sense, the parenting
Mhm.
energy as well. How can I help and help guide and he offer some clarity and so on. And so it feels to me like you're working with those three currents. You're
Mhm.
working with those three service goals, or archetypes, if you like, in your
Yeah.
life. Yeah.
Yeah. Very much so. I encountered this quote a few days ago. The project of empire is to dull the senses. The project of the poet is to wake up the senses. And that's Ilya Kaminsky, a Jewish Ukrainian poet, speaking about essentially, this is carrying what you're saying, but looking through the lens of the collective. And so it touches the state of the world that we're in, the ecology, but also what is growing. I think is a verifiable mental health crisis. On the collective level.
Yes, because exactly as the quote says, when it talks of the power of empire, this is, and you're in a country where one interpretation of what's happening right now is the kind of collapsing of empire.
Mm,
But although it seems to be an empire consolidating its power,
mhm,
and yet, many people will interpret it as the sort of the beginning of the end of the American
mm,
empire. How does it? I appreciate this is sensitive territory,
mm,
but how does it feel for you to be in the States right now, given all that's happening?
mm. Well, it's disturbing. And I think you're right on with that sentiment. We're coming up on what is essentially the 250th anniversary of the US.
Mm.
And people forget that when it comes to nation states, we're a baby.
Yeah.
We're not even in our adolescence yet. And when you compare the US to Europe and China and India, there's a sense of ancient civilization.
Mm.
There's buildings that are older than this country
Yeah.
right down the street from you.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
So I think we have to really take what's happening through a larger arc of history and recognize that in some ways this is actually predictable. And one of the terms that Carl-Jung spoke a lot about was enantiodromia. And it's this idea that psychic energy is a reality and that it can move an individual person in their life, their individual psyche, but it can also influence and move entire swaths of people, a collective. And he writes about, for instance, Nazi Germany. I mean, he predicted what was going to happen there years before it did, simply from observing the quote unquote charisma of Hitler.
Yeah.
And he sort of zeroed in on him very early and said,
Right.
we need to watch this guy because he's manifesting some things here that are going to have a sway over certain people. Yeah.
And of course, somebody who is charismatic has
Mm.
done exactly the same thing in the States,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
because whatever we might think of Trump, he has this charismatic power, some ability in his disinhibition in a way,
Yeah.
rather interestingly, in his brazenness and disinhibition, and of course his familiarity with the world of entertainment
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
to hold people's attention. And do you have any sense of where this is going?
Well, it's really hard to say because it isn't all up to him, of course.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
in some ways, the way I think of this from a transpersonal perspective is
Mm.
that, he is not the cause. He
Mm.
was the vehicle that uncorked unprocessed energies that are part of the national psyche of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's certain things that this country has yet to face and reckon with and commit energy toward transforming.
Yeah. Stephen Dinan, the CEO of the Shift Network, writes
Mm-hmm.
about how he feels that it's the wounded masculine,
Mm-hmm.
which of course then becomes the toxic masculine energy that needs healing, and that
Mm-hmm.
has emerged, and how that plays out and how exactly it gets healed is I guess really hard for us to predict, isn't it? Yeah. But I think I completely resonate with what you say about taking this kind of historical. It's almost like you take a step back. It's
Mm-hmm.
very easy to get caught up in the drama of it,
Yeah.
but to take a step back and to see there's this 250-year-old country and all the particular kind of historical influences on it, and the unexpressed, and as you say, that
Yeah.
Trump is just a kind of is expressing something that has always been there, as
Yeah.
a number of people have talked about this. Yeah. Yeah. And do you feel a sense of loss and grief in the what seems to be like this loss of, in a sense, of democracy, of this
Mm-hmm.
movement towards a kind of fascism that could go horribly, you know what I mean? It's already gone horribly wrong in
Mm-hmm.
many ways, but it could have long-lasting consequences. Or
Sure.
do you, if you hold in both hands, is the possibility that this will just get America will become essentially a kind of dictatorship that's run in a
Mm-hmm.
systematic way? Or do you, in the other hand, the possibility that somehow something will happen, or things will change, or something will be worked through,
Yeah.
and America will emerge sort of phoenix-like out of this in some way?
Yeah. Uh, First of all, that's my hope.
Yeah,
But my sense, going back to that concept of enantiodromia,
yeah,
Jung talked about how essentially the conditions of a circumstance can swing so far to a particular extreme that the law of enantiodromia requires it to swing back toward the center.
yeah,
It's this pendulum. The image is a pendulum that swings.
yeah.
And so I have been holding this sense of this is a larger process unfolding.
Hmm.
Another image that comes to me is the phrase is off gassing. When these individuals who are archaeologists, let's say, they go down to, say, Central America and they stumble upon a temple that was under the jungle canopy, they didn't know it was there,
Yeah.
they go in and they're looking essentially for the treasures that's there, the cultural record that's there. They can't immediately go in there because when they open up those stone doors, there's all this toxic gas that comes out.
Okay.
And so they have to let that off gas
Right.
before it is safe to go into the inner depths, essentially, to explore it. And in some fashion, I think that's what's happening here. Is there
Right.
an
Okay.
off gassing going on?
Yeah. At a collective level, what can happen in individual spiritual development and in psychotherapy, where
Yes.
you know c- w- confronting the shadow and dealing with the extremely uncomfortable
Yep.
and unpleasant and painful experiences that might result from that. But if you hang
Mhm.
on in there long enough,
Yep.
one could use an alchemical kind of
Right.
analogy too. Yeah, that's a nice way to look at it. And so it's all about you gave this image of the archaeologist sort of standing back. It's almost like I guess the question for anybody in the States is how can I kind of step out of the way
Yes.
and and just not get affected by this, which is fine if you don't have any issues around your
Right.
paperwork.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So that's in a nutshell. I feel like there is a larger process happening, and my sense and my hope is that it leads to a greater seasoning. It's going to take seasons to get there,
yeah,
and it's not going to be instant. Um, but my hope is that it leads to a maturation, a wisening, and a reconnecting with the heart
yeah,
from the standpoint of, I mean, that was probably the first moment where I realized we were getting in the deep end here was when all of the funds for USAID had been turned off, which is
yeah,
all of the humanitarian activities
yeah.
that the US was supporting. And so that was the
That
red
was the
flag.
moment when you felt, "Wow, it's getting bad." Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, it was already bad before, like,
yeah, yeah,
like having the uncle at the family reunion who says anything and pisses everybody off, and but where policy began to change to the extent that it was going to lead to deaths.
yeah. Well, exactly. And I learned yesterday. Apparently, Trump has taken the protections of 59 million acres of forest
Yes,
so that
exactly.
logging can commence in and is it am I right in saying it's 59 million acres?
It's 59 million acres. Yeah,
That's just yeah.
doesn't mean that that's all going to get clear cut, but what it does is, from a policy point of view, is it opens up all of that national forest land for harvesting timber. Yeah, and of course that doesn't sit well with us.
Well, exactly, yeah, particularly for Druids who love trees. Frank, do you have a poem you can read to finish?
So this is entitled Subterranean,
Mm,
and it kind of has the energies of what we've been talking about in a way. All night I tumbled in the dark, downward at times, at other times pulled along as if in a great unseen current. I kept bumping into parts of myself on the way down, the forgotten, the disavowed, the shamed, repressed, the untended, the uncultivated. It was like encountering an old abandoned homestead of yesteryear, rusty tools discarded to rot in meadows, half-buried brown and cobalt blue bottles holding medicines I'd forgotten I need. Then, as the underworld is apt to be, a series of encounters down the fractal passageways and haunted layers of time. Fierce memories, and memories stacked upon memories. The difference being that this time I came bearing the lantern of heart-mind. The difference being that this time I was accompanied by a luminous procession. It was not my lantern alone. The glow of multiple lights casting upward onto the underside of branches and leaves revealed details of the inner forest. There are roadside shrines there, hidden forest pools for purification, fields of abandoned armor from long forgotten battles. So that's an incomplete poem, but in some fashion there I'm working with that imagery of what's left untended and unexamined in the subterranean depths, whether that's the individual person and their psyche or a nation.
Thank you. And that'll be published, that'll be in the volume that gets published, the fourth volume. Thank you so much for
Great
this.
to see you, Philip.
And hope to talk to you again soon.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care. Be sure to subscribe, share, and join me next time for more inspiration.